Up until 2020, when the Maryland General Assembly took control over the state's budget from Governor Larry Hogan, the governor set the budget, and the General Assembly could reduce the amount of spending or move money around, but it was all within the governor's spending plan. But since the shift in 2021 occurred, when lawmakers passed a new law that gave the legislature more power to alter the state budget, and ever since, there's been a budget crisis as the legislature keeps spending and spending. Going into this session of the legislature, Governor Moore knew that there was a projected budget deficit of $3 billion. And in response, the governor proposed radical changes to the state income tax by creating new, more progressive rates and eliminating the ability to take certain deductions on capital gains. Yesterday, it was learned that the revised economic forecast prediction that the deficit will grow by an additional $300 million, and now everybody's scrambling for money. Mike, there are now renewed proposals to tax sugar soft drinks and business services. How bad is this crisis facing the state? Wes Moore yesterday said it was a major problem.
Oh, I think it is a major problem. I think it's a very challenging time. I think one of the significant challenges, obviously, was the investment that was made in the blueprint for education. Unfortunately, they didn't identify a pathway to fund that, and that's creating real difficulty because now you've got competing policies. And obviously, one of the significant effort we have in any legislative body is how do you make reductions? And so the reality is we've got to figure that out. They've got to figure that out because we know we're going to see more coming from the federal government that's going to have an impact on the state. And so to just kind of put out proposals that are going to increase revenue sources without an understanding of what you're going to reduce on the other side, knowing we're going to see additional cuts or additional impact on the economy coming from the federal government, I think is a pretty short-sighted approach. So I think you're going to have to look at some revenue, but I think you're going to have to take very, very measured cuts or delay certain policies, which are going to be challenging for people to get to. But I think you don't have another approach but to take that way.
Well, it seems to me that the House of Delegates has a different approach to things than maybe the Senate does. The House of Delegates seems to be continuing to spend and expand programs where the Senate at least is considering cuts. Stacey, unlike the federal government, Maryland is required to balance its budget. But as I said, after the General Assembly rejected minor cuts in the education general plan, does it seem like anyone really cares in Annapolis?
Casey, the real question is care about what? Keep in mind that prior to 2020, Maryland was one of the most restrictive budgetary states in the country. But in the off-year elections of 2020, voters here passed question 1 on the ballot, which was a constitutional amendment giving the state legislature the power to increase, decrease, or add items to the state budget, assuming those expenditures didn't exceed the governor's cap, right? So what this allowed is reallocation of funds to different priorities. And given that we have a Democrat supermajority in the legislature, and now with diluted executive power, we have a lot more horse trading going on for pet projects. And the net effect makes the budget process less efficient, I think, and more politically driven. So the real danger with that supermajority is that the Democrats are fighting among themselves to enact their pet projects rather than court services while not keeping an eye on the bottom line. So does anyone in Annapolis care, to your question? Well, mostly about their pet projects, which has true consequences for long-term strategic planning. And here we are, $3 billion and counting in a pet project pothole.
Well, yesterday, the governor appeared with the comptroller of Maryland, and to reveal the new projection of a $300 million further deficit. And I think he was doing that just to reemphasize to the General Assembly that there needs to be some moderation taking place. And frankly, even the projections that the governor has in his budget don't seem to add up to the $3 billion number that the deficit is calling for. So, Mike, what happens if they can't balance the budget?
Well, they have to balance the budget. So they'll get there. The challenge becomes, how do they balance that budget? And the reality is to me, this has to be a year where you are making significant reductions while possibly also looking at some revenue increases. But this can't be a smoke and mirrors activity. This doesn't get better. And I think, as he often wants to do, Adam Pagnuccio did a really good piece early this morning where he talked about why Maryland is so uniquely positioned and the challenge I think our legislature and governor face. One, we are one of the top six states in the country for household income. We are top 3 in education, and we have among the least amount of income inequality of any of the states in the country. And so those are highly unique things to pull together in a single package. And so what they've got to be able to do is to navigate through this to retain those key elements that make Maryland a great place. I appreciate Stacey's comments on the pet projects. The reality is pet projects by themselves aren't going to get to those kinds of numbers. It really is looking at education, looking at big things and trying to figure out how you're going to do those in a more moderated fashion.
Well, but if you look at the governor's proposals, I mean, much of the governor's proposals are very radical. The whole change to the income tax structure, adding new layers to the income tax, but also eliminating deductions. So you only have one standardized deductions. And as you mentioned, Adam Pagnuccio, as he's pointed out repeatedly, these changes will fall on Montgomery County residents disproportionately to everyone else in the state. So will our delegation go along with these proposals, or will they push back?
Well, they'll probably push back, but the reality is that if you're going to push back, then what's your alternative? And I think that becomes the very difficult piece, because either you've got to come back with other ways to reduce the budget, or you've got to come back with other revenue sources. And so far, all I'm seeing are coming back with other revenue sources at a time when increasing burden on businesses, when we see a significant impact on federal impacts in the state, is exactly the time you don't want to be increasing that burden on businesses, because we've got to increase the private sector growth.
Stacey, last year, Delegate Moon introduced the idea that there would be a tax on business services. He reintroduced it just this past week. It was a non-starter last year, as business groups, really came out in mass to oppose it. Now, there have been tweaks, some carve-outs, but still, a business-to-business tax is just a further disincentive for businesses to locate in Montgomery County.
I couldn't agree with you more on that, Casey. And as an independent contractor in real estate, I am subject to many of those taxes. So, for example, if I hire a photographer, he can't just charge me a flat fee anymore. He has to put a tax surcharge on those services, which means that that's going to be going up. And so all of that, gets stacked up and makes it more and more painful in the overall picture for the residents of Montgomery County and the state of Maryland.
Yeah, I don't envy the General Assembly in the last 40 days of the legislature, but they've got to come up with some better solutions than they have so far.